Small Changes by Digit 27, Chapter 6, New Changes. Both Naruto and Shisui had to repress their laughter as they stared down at the remarkably short businessman standing in front of them. He was completely consumed in his conversation with Ensui. When the man had first opened the door of his rather luxurious apartment, Naruto had thought it must have been somehow automatically opened. It turned out Naruto was just looking straight over Gato's head, a fact that didn't seem to have passed by the tiny businessman. Since then, the man seemed to harbor an unspoken grudge towards the two shinobi, minus Itachi, because he always seemed to disappear into the background whenever laughter emerged. But due to add insult to injury, even Sushui, the shortest of them, managed to stand a few inches above the man, despite being less than half his age. It was all they could to not to stop snickering every time he would shoot them a glare. To quote Naruto, he said, "If Uncle were here, she would be attempting to try that Western sport involving kicking a ball around." In honesty, though, that was the highlight of the remaining mission. Otherwise, it was luxurious at best. It turned out that after they defeated Masi, the harassment attempted and hits on Gato's head just stopped all of a sudden. It swelled Shushu's ego for a while, thinking that the assassins feared their team. At least it did until Itachi reminded him that they could merely be waiting for them to leave, so they would have better chances. No matter what the reason, the results were the same. The three of them became quickly bored. At least Naruto got off slightly easy. He had a scroll with him to jot down notes that struck him. Even so, they still managed to squeeze in as much training as they could, using the opportunities when they weren't guarding Gato. Itachi was seriously impressed by the rate Susui managed to pick up on the Sharingan techniques he began showing him. He had even remarked one day that because the way their fights were slowly turning, it was like he had already unlocked the Dojutsu's predictive abilities. Nato hadn't had a chance to spar with Susui yet, but when he did, he would be sure to remind the Uchiha that he wasn't suddenly invincible. Quickly, though, the time they were assigned to the mission came and went, and before they knew it, they were back on the road. Naruto had the pleasure of turning one last time to catch one of the Gato's distasteful looks before returning his attention to the path ahead. I really hated that guy. He didn't need to turn to see the enthusiastic nod he got from Susui or the slight smirk from Itachi. You shouldn't say those kinds of things about the client. It's far too bothersome to deal with the aftermath. Naruto just huffed, blowing air out between his teeth in irritation. It passed quickly. He's not the client anymore, and Sweet just shrugged lazily before he suddenly jumped into the trees above them, the Genin quickly following. That's not to say he couldn't be in the future. Naruto just huffed again, unable to deny the man's lazy logic, yet still annoyed by it all the same. He checked around them as they sprinted through the tree branches, looking for any sign of an ambush like the one at the start of their mission. In honesty, he kind of missed it. That had been the first real opportunity they had to prove themselves, and he wanted to feel that rush again. He noticed Susui running next to him, Sharingan active as it had been ever since he had acquired them. At first, Itachi had warned him that it would simply waste his chakra. However, after Naruto had pointed out that it could almost work like a passive chakra control exercise, he too had taken to keeping his dojutsu frequently active. That wasn't to say it was indefinite. Even for an Uchiha, their eyes were taxing on their chakra systems. Even so, the Uchiha prodigy had definitely noticed a slight rise in both his already considerable control and hearty fortitude. It was another reason Naruto was anxious to get back to Konoha. He didn't like his teammates suddenly having this edge over him. He needed to get back and start training seriously again. His speed and chakra control among the priorities. He smirked as he sprinted. He knew exactly the jutsu that could help him with that, as well as kill two birds with one stone. He had been putting off going through his father's things for long enough. Well, that was boring as hell. All he got were two nods of agreement from his teammates, surprising him as he saw Itachi actually agreeing that something was boring. Yeah, I wonder if all mission reports are like that. Naruto just shrugged honestly. He wasn't sure what he had been expecting. A smirk suddenly crossed his face. Then again, it might have been worth it to see the look on the old man's face when Ensui Sensei told him we faced Iwa Stone Bull.
Sushi laughed at that, and even Itachi smirked. Sarutobi had almost lost his pipe when he heard that and was unable to stop staring at the three, getting in surprise for the rest of the meeting. Must you call Hokage-sama something so disrespectful? I would have thought your own father having been Hokage would make you more inclined to respect the position. Naruto just chuckled as they walked down the streets, enjoying being back after a few weeks. I have the highest respects for the position, but for me, respect in a person is earned, not given. Itachi raised an eyebrow at this, but didn't break stride as they continued to move towards the Uchiha compound, and by slight extension, the Namikaze household, and his defending the village through the second and third shinobi wars, as well as his aides and defending the QB on top of his years of service to the village are not grounds for respect. Naruto just gave Itachi a blank look before looking ahead and walking a little faster. Itachi glanced at Sushi, but his fellow Uchiha just shrugged, not knowing what had Naruto so touchy all of a sudden. Naruto, the leaf is our home, and Hokage-sama is our leader. Naruto turned on Sushi swiftly, and anger and betrayal in his eyes that they had never seen in him before. And where was he when my parents died? Where was he when I went home to an empty house, where I knew I would never see them again? Sushi could only blink in surprise as he took a step back, not expecting the outburst. A few civilians even stopped to look at them. Itachi went to put a hand on his friend's shoulder, but the redhead shrugged off the contact. 6 months! It took him 6 months after their funeral for him to visit me. I know he's busy, but 6 months! Itachi just looked lost, unable to speak because he didn't know what to say. Naruto just breathed heavily for a few moments before turning on the heel and sprinting away, leaving the two Uchiha speechless in the middle of the street. He raced back through the village, moving towards the one place where he could think clearly, where his mind didn't become one big angry blur. He vaulted the walls of his home in one bound, dashing around the side of the house until he was able to stop and stand still out in the training ground. He looked down at the reflection of himself in the small pond, watching as the wind gently disturbed the image that stared back at him. He collapsed at his knees, eyes still locked on the water until a single drop disturbed the pond, rippling the image until he couldn't see himself anymore. He wiped away the other tear that was just about to fall, stifling a sob as he angrily punched the water, turned away from it harshly to lie back on the grass, just staring up at the sky, lost in his thoughts. Time moved on, and Naruto apologized to his friends. He knew he shouldn't have lashed out like that, but he was bottling up his emotions unhealthily. They of course forgave him, after very little thought, but to say their eyes hadn't been opened slightly would have been an injustice. To Sushi, Naruto always had been a pillar of strength. Before he became along, he was always known as the other Uchiha, the one that wasn't Itachi. Of course, he held no resentment towards his cousin, but it was lonely when everybody else only paid attention to the prodigy. To see Naruto, someone who worked hard for what he wanted and achieved it without any kind of Kekigenkai or dojutsu, it made him hope. He was the calm one, the one who kept his head but still found the time to have fun and enjoy life. To see him lose it like that, it cracked the image the aspiring Uchiha had of his friend. In the same way thought helped their friendship. When Sushi stopped seeing Naruto as some kind of goal to strive for, and instead saw a person with emotions and limits, he found it easier to smile and speak softly with Naruto after those thoughts. For Itachi, his body clenched painfully in silence. With both he and Naruto would call each other friends. He knew it was a loose term at best. They were sparring partners, rivals, people who used each other to improve themselves. He never went over to talk, never saw a purpose to that. He never specifically considered Naruto for something other than a mechanism for training. In a way, Itachi envisioned his cousin. Sushi and Naruto were friends, that much anybody could admit. When he witnessed how wrenched Naruto felt about feelings abandoned about the third, and perhaps by his parents, he realized that something would need to change. Over time, after that incident, the three only managed to grow closer. Itachi began to try more, acting like a friend instead of an acquaintance. Susui and Naruto were already close, frequently spending time together, but afterwards each practically lived in the other's house. There would always be a place set for Naruto in Susui's home and a bed ready for Susui in Naruto's. They continued to do missions, already excelling and getting noted for their expectable teamwork and initiative in tight situations. In the 6 months after that, both Sushi and Itachi managed to reach the final stage of their Sharingan, the youngest in recorded Uchiha history since Mother Uchiha, Anko. Well, she was Anko. If there was something in Naruto's life he could count on to always be there and never change, it was her. She was like an immovable rock. When she had heard about the way he had erupted at his friends, she had forced him to go straight over and apologize. After squeezing him to death for about 5 minutes, of course, it had led to an amusing conversation regarding who exactly was the guardian in their relationship. Needless to say, it didn't end well for Naruto, and he ended up in the Uchiha district with an aching side. It turned out that during his absence on the mission, Anko had practically thrown herself into her studies and training, easily becoming the top shinobi in her class. Naruto couldn't wipe the grin off his face when he heard that, but there was a lot of teasing about her having nothing else to do without him around. It was amusing because of the shade of red her face had turned when she couldn't think of a suitable comeback or answer. 6 months later, and nothing had changed. Anko was still flying through the academy with the distinction, although she did have Naruto helping her whenever he could between missions. It turned out that after their first successful B ranked mission, it had opened the floodgates. After a while, they even began to be specifically requested by clients. Although some were skeptical when they actually showed up due to their age, the team wasn't complaining though. The missions paid well, and usually the most they had to deal with was the occasional E-rated A-ranked missing nin. In essence, life was good. Everyone in their close-knit group was never bored, never abandoned to themselves. Naruto and Anko's frantic antics were enough to keep Sushin entertained while Itachi found pleasure in training and carrying out his missions. Sometimes Naruto believed he believed too heavily in the ideals of the village and not enough in his own, but he couldn't really do much about it. Despite not being open with Itachi, could almost prove to be as stubborn as an Uzumaki. Whether you could take that as a compliment or not was debatable, however. Finally, time had passed quickly enough that Naruto found himself lazily yet nervously sitting on the couch in his home. He was trying to flick through a scroll of intermediate ceiling, but his mind really wasn't focused on the paper in his hands. Instead, his gaze kept flickering between it and the door, anxiously awaiting Anko to walk through. She had passed her gaining exam a few days ago, the only one in her class to do so, even though others had tried. That worried Naruto, thinking she might be placed with an older group of genin who would no doubt belittle her or underappreciate her because of her age. Right now she was in the academy with the rest of the genin who had passed this year, all likely waiting for their Jonin sensei to arrive, or already having met them. He desperately wanted to know who she got. It would more than likely define the kunoichi she would become in the future, even with his own influence in her training. They say there was always at least one student who took after their sensei in the group. At least it was Susui. Just as he was about to get up and move outside to train and calm his nerves, he heard the front door open. He swiveled on a dime and immediately walked over to the hall, where he watched the grinning uncles practically bounce through the door. The sight brought a smile to his face. The Jonin instructor must have been a good one for her to be so happy. So I take it by your smile it went well. Uncle just beamed as she skipped towards him. Actually skipped. It was enough to make him double take. Uncle wasn't practically girly, so to see her acting this way was weird to say the least. Better than well and awesome. The redhead just raised an eyebrow, chuckling as he followed the euphoric girl back through the house to where she simply flopped down on the couch with a satisfied smile. So who did you get? Uncle's happy smile quickly morphed into a very mischievous and somewhat smug grin as she turned and stared him right in the eyes. Oh, nobody! She turned distinctly and began to pick at her fingernails with a kunai, a habit Naruto had no idea how she picked up because it wasn't from him. Just you know, Orochimaru of the Sannin, she said it with such nonchalance that it actually took a moment for Naruto to register what she had said. Orochimaru, as in teammate of Jiraiya, the guy who trained my father. Uncle just nodded happily, yet again with that same slight smug look on her features. The one and only, And not only, but he took me on as an apprentice. Naruto blinked in surprise. He wasn't doubting Anko's abilities, of course, or Orochimaru's judgment. In fact, Anko was an astounding Kunoichi already. There was the fact that it was almost unheard of for somebody to take such a young apprentice. At that age, it was usually difficult to predict the kind of ninja the student would become. Even so, that didn't stop the smile that spread across Naruto's face as he pulled Anko into a somewhat unexpected hug. Congratulations! Anko was shocked for only a brief moment before she accepted the hug, smiling happily into Naruto's shoulder until he broke away. Thanks. I already knew it's going to be awesome. He's going to teach me so many cool jutsu. Maybe I'll even get a summoning contract. Naruto grinned again. Getting a contract was one of the greatest honors bestowed on a shinobi, usually passed down from partner to child or sensei to student. His own father had inherited the Toad contract from Jiraiya, as Anko would no doubt receive the Snake contract from Orochimaru. Well, I think we should celebrate. Anko initially looked happy at that thought, but her face suddenly took on a slightly green tinge as she remembered the last time the two had celebrated. She knew that she knew she now knew that alcohol, no matter how delicious, would have to wait until she was older, and it wouldn't incapacitate her for an entire day. All right, how about visiting that new restaurant that opened up, the Dango place? Naruto just nodded happily, already getting up and pulling on his tracksuit top. Today was Uncle's day, and they would do whatever she wanted to do. As they left, Uncle was wondering how Dango tasted, never having had the pleasure of tasting the sweet dumplings. Ironic, considering her namesake, she just shrugged. She would find out soon anyway. Naruto just watched on in a subtle mix between horror, fascination, and jealousy. It turned out that Anko liked Dango. By liked, Naruto meant that Anko had taken to the sweet, delicious dumplings like fish do to water, or birds to air, or he did to ramen. It was both disgusting and hypnotic to watch her shovel down the food, sliding the treats of the skewers, sometimes in one bite. It was just something to try and imagine where she was putting it all. As far as he could tell, she didn't even appear to be slowing down after the fifth plate. He had to admit the dumplings were pretty delicious, not as much as ramen, but they would probably consist his favorite desserts from now on. However, when he reached for his own, Uncle would merely slap his hand away before picking up the skewer, despite having more in her own hands. In the end, just to get any food at all, he had to resort to using his speed to quickly steal the dango from the ravenous girl as quickly as possible. Finally, although it seemed like it would never end, Uncle sat lazily back in her chair with contented, lidded eyes as she gently swallowed and allowed her delicious meal to settle. He smiled, watched, matched her body language, relaxed and content. It at least uh, it at least let Naruto know that what to get an uncle if she was ever in a mood again. The sweet dumplings were better than drugs. Suddenly the girl shot forward in her chair, sitting bolt upright as her eyes became fixed on something at the door to the small dango bar. Naruto turned only to see a tall man with long black hair wearing the standard joining garb, the navy jumpsuit with the olive flag jacket. He walked confidently and seemed to hold an aura of power about himself, with his yellow eyes shadowed experience and intelligence. Of course, Naruto immediately knew who it was. His teammate's fight with Hanzo of the Salamander was legendary after all. Orochimaru Sensei? Well, at least that confirmed it. The older man took note of the excitable purple-haired girl, waving to him, and smiled warmly. His smirk held a little bit of a calculative edge, but otherwise he appeared friendly and kind, if a bit distant and aloof. Ah, Uncle-chan, surprised seeing you here so soon after we met nonetheless. Uncle just grinned happily as she motioned between Naruto and her sensei. Naruto, this is Orochimaru Sensei, and she would have continued if Orochimaru hadn't placed a hand on her shoulder. No need, child. I know of Namikaze-kun already. How could I not know of our dear departed Hokage-san? Naruto blinked a moment, confused when he thought he heard a hint of bitterness when the man mentioned his father, but quickly shrugged it off as his ears playing tricks. He held out a hand, which Orochimaru took, only a slight hint of hesitation to substitute Naruto's previous confusion. Nice to meet you, San. Orochimaru just smiled, the edges of his lips turning up. So formal, like your father. This time there was nothing. The snake-like man kept his voice perfectly level, although his handshake was rather tight. Uncle didn't seem to notice the tension between the two, only happy that her best friend and soon-to-be mentor were getting along. We need more dango, Naruto groaned while Orochimaru just seemed amused. He had certainly chosen an interesting apprentice. Uncle was outside working on a jutsu her sensei had instructed her to learn. I expected except the only problem was she was finding it incredibly difficult. Surprisingly, Naruto was no help. The redhead had been very mysterious over the last few days. Whenever she would ask him to train, he would simply reply he was busy before returning to his father's study. She had tried to get in and see what it was that he was so enraptured with, but it was nearly impossible to sneak up on the boy, at least for her. She focused on her techniques again, molded the chakra Orochimaru had said it was required as she tried to unconsciously tap into the summoning contract. Slowly she went through the hand seals. Her sensei had told her that if she kept at it, she would do it without them, but for now this would do. She built up the chakra before sticking out both arms, letting her new long sleeve shirt hang loosely from her wrist. Hidden shadow snake hands. She gritted her teeth before miraculously a single long green snake slithered from her wrists, building its body from the chakra she provided. She sighed when it dispelled. She was still unable to maintain the chakra required to use it effectively, but at least it was a start. She nearly flopped to the floor out of exhaustion, but caught herself on a training post, managing to move her body back towards the house to see if Naruto wanted anything to eat. However, as soon as she crossed the threshold of the house, she heard what sounded like a slight buzzing coming from upstairs, like a swirling wind. Yes! Uncle just raised an eyebrow as she turned her head upwards towards where she heard the cry. With a tired sigh, she dragged herself up the stairs and walked over to the old Hokage's study. Tentatively, she pushed open the door, surprised when it actually opened. Naruto had usually kept it locked when he was working on his secret project. Oddly, the room was empty save for a scroll on the desk with complex notes and diagrams as well as what appeared to be balloons and rubber balls dotted around the room, all bursts. Suddenly she heard the same strange sound and made her way over to the window to look out over the training field out back. Naruto was outside, the redhead apparently staring at his right hand in intense concentration. To the young girl's amazement, chakra began to swirl hypnotically around his palm, seemingly drawn out of the air itself. Finally it coalesced into a perfect sphere, just larger than Naruto's hand, which pulsed almost excitingly with blue swirling energy. If Uncle had been amazed by that little display, what came next practically had her on the floor out of shock.
Naruto charged at a nearby tree, slamming the ball of what seemed like pure, unbridled energy into the trunk. Instead of stopping or fading away, the sphere just kept going, sharing through the tree like it was butter. Finally, Naruto pushed it all the way through, watching with a satisfied smile as the large tree simply toppled over, its support now weakened.
He spotted the purple blur out of the corner of his eye, sidestepping as she raced past. She was suddenly full of energy. She excitedly looked at the remains of the tree, not just a haphazard stump in the ground, before turning back to Naruto with a look of pure amazement. What was that? Naruto just smiled sheepishly as he rubbed the back of his head, noting the slight tingle in his right hand that let him know the technique wasn't quite perfect yet. That was what I've been working on recently. When it looked like Uncle wasn't going to be satisfied with that answer, he sighed and continued. It's a jutsu my father created as a complement to his fighting style. Basically just high tier chakra control. Uncle just blinked at the very humble way Naruto described the incredible technique he just displayed. After seeing what it did to a fully grown tree, she could only imagine what kind of damage it could do to an opponent. Chakra control? Naruto just nodded as he held out his right hand, palm upwards, just slightly cupping his fingers quicker than before the Rasengan formed, once again pulsing brightly with blue light as the energies contained within Naruto's palm tried to break free of their spiral prison. It's pure shape manipulation, according to the controls. The scrolls he based it off of some kind of attack used by Biju, scaled down, of course. He suddenly looked down slightly sadly as Uncle noted, staring wistfully at the large ball of chakra. It's unfinished, though. Uncle raised an eyebrow while simultaneously scoffing. From what she had seen, that attack was anything but unfinished. She couldn't imagine what the proper version would look like or even do. In the scrolls, it said he always wanted to add his elemental affinity into it, but between the war and becoming Hokage, he never found the chance. He sighed again before a small smile worked its way onto his now rather apparently tired features. But that's why I'm going to do it for him. I'll add my elemental affinity and make him proud. Uncle smiled at that, unable to avoid being caught up in his infectious confidence that spilled out like waves. So what's it called? Naruto grinned as he slammed the sphere of energy through another tree. Rasengan. Uncle just stared at the newly disfigured tree for a moment or with what can only be described as awe before grinning right back. Oh, you are so teaching me that. The next month passed in a blur of training for everyone. Aside from missions, the two Uchiha stayed in their compound a lot, apparently both being trained in the Sharingan. Apparently it was some kind of tradition for when an Uchiha reached the three Tomoe state. However, it had never happened to at such a young age. Naruto missed Suishui's company, but he had plenty to keep himself occupied in the meantime, and he knew they would all come back stronger for it. He continued to work on the Rasengan, experimenting with making it bigger or more concentrated. He knew elemental manipulation was a bit out of his league at the moment, only recently getting to grips with his wind affinity to even begin to attempt it. Instead, he trained his speed as usual, as well as trying to teach Anko the Rasengan. Strangely, the girl didn't seem to take to it, apparently finding the concept of molding her chakra into something visible hard to wrap her head around. When Naruto had asked the Hokage about this during one of his frequent visits, he had simply replied it had been the same when Minato had tried to teach his own students. Apparently, the technique in itself wasn't all that difficult to achieve. It was just so alien an idea to most that they couldn't wrap their heads around it. Even Sarutobi had to admit that Minato's self-created jutsu was far beyond even him. He was too set in his old structured ways. However, it appeared that one of his father's students had managed to create their own jutsu based off his father's, apparently making it quite famous, the Raikiri.
That wasn't to say Anko had nothing to keep her occupied. Orochimaru turned out to be quite the intensive sensei. As soon as she would master a technique, he would give her it would be straight on to the next one. He also proved to be very attentive, always willing to help out Anko as long as it was only to adjust what she was doing. Apparently, he praised natural talent, enjoying those that could take a concept and flesh it out on their own without assistance. To be fair, it showed commitment, ingenuity, and creativity, all good qualities in a shinobi. Naruto often watched the two of them during his own training, at least when Orochimaru actually supervised Anko's training in the Namikaze's training ground. When the man had first seen Naruto use the Rasengan, obliterating a training dummy in the process, he had first been stunned. He had quickly recovered, congratulating the redhead on mastering such a difficult jutsu that he begrudgingly admitted he could not recreate. Naruto found the man's company to be pleasant. He was incredibly interesting to listen to, and he had many stories from his time as part of the Sonin, at least when they were a team. While he sometimes came off as slightly arrogant when his reputation was brought into question, it was actually understandable. He had once jokingly suggested a spar between the two of them. Needless to say, he dominated the fight from start to finish. At least Naruto learned that day that Orochimaru wasn't the kind to pull a punch, or in his case, a snake. The man was like wind when Naruto wanted to hit him, and despite all the advancements he had made in the area, his speed was nothing compared to the Sannin. His body still burned a little from the toxins the man kept pumping him with various snake bites. All his attacks would come out of nowhere, all in inconvenient means, like through the ground or once even out of a tree, and all Naruto could plainly see that he was outclassed hopelessly and without somehow injecting 15 years of training in the forthcoming months that wasn't going to change anytime soon. Anko also showed marked improvements under his tutelage, mastering jutsu after jutsu, including some unique to the Sanin himself. He had allowed her to sign the snake summoning contract, which had involved a frightful experience with Manda, the boss summon, that would be ingrained into Naruto's memory for quite some time. The two of them would be starting missions soon, which lowered Naruto's spirits slightly, knowing that they would only see less of one another in the next few years. Still, it only meant that he had to make the time he had no count all the more. End of chapter 6.